Based in Chicago. Attended DePaul University, and he actually started medical school at University of Chicago as a teenager, where he was an MSTP student and has his PhD in both biophysics and theoretical biology, which we learned all about at dinner last night. He did his anesthesia residency at Harvard, and then he returned to the University of Chicago, where he was not only on faculty, but had a not surprising rise to leadership positions. So he was both the dean of multicultural affairs, but then he had a provost position for both research and minority issues. He has such a long list of leadership positions. I do have to just refer to my notes, but leadership's not just with local medical societies in Chicago and Illinois, but multiple preeminent leadership positions with the AMA, the National Medical Association, the US Department of Education, and founded the James Bowman Society, University of Chicago, focused on achieving diversity and academic excellence and elimination of health inequities. He did leave University of Chicago to take a job as the executive vice president and chief academic officer at the Ochsner Health System in New Orleans, and then came back to Chicago for his position at the ACGME. So for all of us that were at the Journal Club, undoubtedly, he's an expert in this field. Could listen to him speak for much longer than we have for the talk this morning. He's invited to speak all over the entire country. I don't honestly know how you keep up with your travel schedule, but still returns to spend time with his wife and 3 children. And he gave an amazing talk at Robert Gladden at the Academy this year, and we were very honored and excited that he agreed to speak to us to start off our Grand Round series. So please join me in welcoming Dr. McDade.
So thank you very much, Dr. Zimmel. That was a great pleasure to be with you last night at dinner and the group. And the resident session this morning was fantastic for Journal Club. And my hope is that we'll be able to learn a few more things even during this session. I just want to make sure of time. Is it, I got about a half an hour from now, 40 minutes or so, is that right? 40, 45. Terrific. Well, I've got 88 slides, so you're not going to see them all. But here's the thing, a few of them are really good, and those will stick on for a little bit longer. So I've got nothing to disclose. I work for the ACGME. I serve on a couple of health equity advisory boards, and I'll start with the office. So we founded the office about 3 years ago at the ACGME, and it came after a task force that I chaired that said we need to start an office. And so the executive committee decided that they would form it. And then Tom Naska said, Bill, would you be the chief? And so I said, sure, I'll come back to Chicago. And when we set it up, it was predicated on the idea that we'd like to improve healthcare and health of the nation. And that's what the ACGME's mission is about. And you'll see the mission statement in just a second. But when you think about it, Unequal Treatment, the book that's published by the Institute of Medicine at the time, the National Academy of Medicine, really started detailing in great detail the healthcare disparities that exist across our country that are found across a wide variety of clinical settings, disease entities, and are associated with excess mortality in minoritized communities in particular. So let's see if we can fix that problem. And so when we set up the office, we said, well, we should have society view health disparities as a healthcare quality deficiency. Now, I came with that approach because I was a member of the Joint Commission Board at the time. And one of the things that I was urging the Joint Commission to do, and now they're actually doing it, is to think about how they can try to work to eliminate healthcare disparities as well. And we know a little bit about quality and safety because the year before Unequal Treatment was published, that's when Crossing the Quality Chasm was published. And so we started focusing on quality and safety around that time. And I think physicians understand that. And you speak in those languages and physicians get it. So I think that's sort of approach that we should use for healthcare disparity elimination as well. I think health equity is a means of achieving the elimination of healthcare disparities. And what health equity means is that people have access to a physician to some degree, but then there are all kinds of other things that come into play with health equity. But increasing workforce diversity is a means to achieve health equity. And then finally, I think inclusions of tools, we talked in the Journal Club that it's important if you're going to see diversity be successful. So why does diversity even matter? Well, it's because we live in these racially segregated communities by and large in the United States. And that's where disease burden and health inequities are most heavily concentrated. And we know that people tend to seek medical care within their communities because of issues that we have in society of trust. We know that historically marginalized individuals tend to practice in those underserved communities and serve those marginalized residents. And I'm going to show you data that shows that if you are a Black, a Latinx, or an Asian physician, you will disproportionately care for a patient of your same race and ethnicity. And that the percentage of historically marginalized physicians in training in graduate medical education hasn't changed in the last 15 years. So the idea of can you pick people who are going to be more likely to serve in underserved areas, marginalized communities? And the answer is yes. If you look at data from the medical student questionnaire, graduation questionnaire on the left side of the screen, what you'll see is that if you're African American, you will say, yes, I'm going to serve underserved and marginalized patients in about 60% of the students who are in medical school. The Native American population of medical students, although it's really small, 55% of them say that they're going to serve in these areas. Latinx individuals are around 50%. White and Asian students are in the low 20s. If you wait 4 years and say, well, after being in medical school 4 years, we must have changed their opinion about what they're going to do and how they're going to serve the underserved, the answer is no. The graduation questionnaire, we ask the same question: are you going to serve underserved and marginalized communities? 60%, nearly 60% of African Americans say yes. And the numbers are much lower for white and Asian students. And yet white and Asian students make up almost 80% of the medical students. So we've got a mismatch to some extent of people with their desire to serve underserved and marginalized communities when they finish medical school. And this is one of the problems that we have. What this data shows is from Moy and Bartman, and this is an old paper from '95, which suggested if you are an African American, you are about 23 times, 24 times as likely to take care of an African American than if you're a white physician taking care of an African American. You are also more likely to take care of a poor person, almost 3 times as likely, and 4 times as likely to take care of a Medicaid person, and than you otherwise would if you were a white physician. Let's move on. Tom Leviste, who's now down at Tulane, actually published this a little bit later and showed that if you are an African American physician, your odds are about 10 to 17 times as likely to see a Black patient than as a white physician to see a Black patient. And this is the most recent update of that study. And I'll tell you why the study is hard to do, because the AMA master file is the keeper of NPI numbers and race and ethnicity of physicians. And they have never released a data set that links the two. So that if you want to try to figure out who's taking care of whom or where people practice as a function of race, they have the data, but they do not release it. You could go to their health workforce mapper and figure out where people of different genders, different specialties work. And this was done in response to scope of practice issues, but they don't take that same information from the master file and put it in as a function of race into their health workforce mapper. And there's some good reasons for it. I've served on the board of trustees of the American Medical Association. I asked the chief information officer why we didn't do this. And we now formed a summit. And for the last 3 years, we've been actually looking at how we can do it. And I'm part of a pilot study with a group called CPOM. It's a study in practice outcomes in anesthesia. And for the first time, they're releasing data with respect to race and ethnicity and anesthesiologists. So I have NPI numbers now, or soon we'll have NPI numbers of anesthesiologists, their race and ethnicity, and we can look and compare Medicare data sets and see who they're taking care of. It's going to be exciting to be able to do that work. But this is work from the Cambridge Health Alliance. And what they show is that number 24 times is about the same for African Americans as was found by Moy and Barton. And it's about 19 times for Latinx physicians seeing Latinx patients and about 26 times Asian physicians seeing Asian patients. So this racial concordance is something that exists throughout medicine in the United States. Peter Bach published this in the New England Journal back in 2004 and saw that the likelihood of you taking care of a primary care patient, if you're a primary care Black physician, Black patient, that concordance, 40 times, 40x, compared to the white physicians who are primary care docs that they studied. Well, the benefits of racial concordance is that it addresses that unfortunate reality of how we trust in American society. And it also has been shown by people like Lisa Cooper, Neil Poe, Janice Blanchard, so many others, that the attention to adhere to medical advice is heightened in concordant relationships. Patient satisfaction is better with marginalized individuals. There's actually some data that suggests that improved clinical outcomes in some categories is demonstrated in concordant relationships. But here's the point. It improves access to care for people who would rather forego care than to receive it in an environment that dehumanizes them, discriminates against them, or fails to communicate effectively with them. And so people walk around with orthopedic problems that they probably should treat, and they don't get it treated because they don't trust the physicians. They don't communicate with physicians, and they think they're going to be dehumanized in that environment. And so they limit themselves. Well, the idea of racial concordance isn't something that we're trying to force on people. It's not forcing people to work in communities where they don't want to work. It's not limiting patient access to the best physicians, quote unquote. It's not forcing patients to see doctors of their race and ethnicity. There's a practice and you decided to relegate all the Latin patients to the Latin ex physician in your practice. I think that would be wrong. But on the same side, people tend to seek out care from people like that. And so I think if people want to do that, patient choice plays an important role, proximity plays an important role. And so you also have to have physicians who are willing to take governmental insurance because a number of minoritized communities rely on that. But this is not Bill McDade's idea or even a new idea. This is Abraham Flexner in his report. And in chapter 14, he talks about the medical education of the Negro. And what he points out is that you've got 10 million Negroes along with 60 million whites, and that the Negroes can be sources of infection and disease, and that you have to have physicians who are going to care for them, and the white physicians aren't going to care for them. So you have to make sure that there are going to be Black physicians who can be trained to take care of them. And that they left 2 of the 7 at that time Black medical schools open, and they remain open till this very day. And this is over now 100 years ago. And the idea that was why those 2 hospitals or those 2 medical schools needed to remain open really stems from the work that he did. And actually, he became quite a strong supporter of the Howard University School of Medicine. Howard has more residency programs than any other historically Black college and university affiliated residency program now. But this is where it's predicated, and this is how we live out our life now. When I was a first-year medical student back in 1980, half of the Black physicians in this country trained at either Howard or Meharry. So it is in my lifetime that we have seen the limiting effect of having closed those medical schools on the number of African American physicians in society and our American society. So why do people want to go to physicians of the same race and ethnicity? Well, there's comfort, familiarity, there's language concordance, improved communication, there's psychological and physical safety that's sometimes associated with those. There's trust and respect. It's being perceived as having a shared worldview. Um, but why do physicians practice in those communities and see those patients? Well, in part, it's because of something a group at Harvard described as race conscious professionalism. It's a sense of doing societal good and recognizing your unique role as a professional in that environment, while also navigating the professional role of being a physician. I was fortunate enough to go to medical school about 3 miles from where I went to grade school. And so I will tell you, I got a chance to take care of my kindergarten teacher in the ENT clinic one day as a 4th-year medical student. And I can't tell you who was more thrilled with seeing the other person in the ENT clinic that day, me or Mrs. Ransaw. And the thought is that if you can do this and you recognize that other people aren't doing this, that then you have a sense of professional obligation and it's fulfilling, even though you may not make as much money in doing it. Now, there's also the reality that you may be excluded from certain markets as well, so that because of discrimination and racism. And so that may also be why there's a disproportionate practice pattern of minoritized physicians into minoritized communities. But this race conscious professionalism is very interesting. The 2 other papers I show there on the left side of the screen, Wilkins and Brown, really look at the idea that if you take a minoritized physician from one city and you move that person to another city, they often practice in an environment that was demographically like the city they left. So that sense of professionalism and race conscious professionalism persists even as they leave. Now, my colleague Owen Garrick and Marcella Alsan, who's now at Harvard, but was out here at Stanford, actually set up an experiment on preventive care. And they established practices that had either Black physicians or white physicians, and they had Black men from Oakland go to those practices. And the idea was to see whether they could have an impact on cardiovascular preventive care through having simply concordant relationships. And this was an interesting paper because Marcella Alsan is a PhD economist as well as a physician. And what she found from doing some very elegant work is that Black subjects were more likely to talk to their Black doctor about a wider range of problems and lengthier discussions, and that the Black doctors actually wrote longer notes about their patients than the white doctors who saw the Black patients. And then they found that through some very elegant calculations that cardiovascular impact could be significant in concordant relationships, with a 19% reduction in morbidity because of increased diabetes screening, cholesterol screening, invasive testing, and even return visits, all up about 20% each. and 10% nearly on cardiovascular mortality. Even this is a pre-COVID paper published in 2018. The flu shots were significantly more likely in concordant relationships. And this was published in the National Bureau of Economic Research in one of their working papers. Marcella is a MacArthur Award winner a couple of years ago, as a matter of fact, too. This paper just came out in Health Affairs this summer, which looked at utilization with respect to concordance of care. And what this really amounts to is that they looked at various race physicians, various race physicians, various race patients, and they looked at their healthcare expenditures. And I'll show you the data. There. When you are a white patient taken care of by either a white physician with concordant relationship or a non-white physician, a discordant relationship, your healthcare expenditures are the same. But if you are a Black patient taken care of by a concordant physician, your healthcare expenditures are lower than if you're taken care of by a person who's not of your same race and ethnicity. The same thing is true for Asian physicians. The same thing is true for Latinx physicians and patients, rather, that the healthcare expenditures are a reflection of who takes care of you. And this might be because of being more compliant and trust and all the other sorts of things that go into it. But the fact is that there's a rationale for it. Now, does concordance matter in surgery? There's very few papers that are out there that describe this. There's one paper that did look at it and found that there was no difference and that people actually preferred competent providers, whatever that means, over concordance. And that the editorial that was associated with this paper basically said we need to do more studies because we don't have enough data to be able to assess this. But the idea that you can look at physicians in surgical practices and see differences between how they take care of people is there. This is a paper that was done by a group out of Brigham and Women's Hospital, looking at the outcomes of surgeons based on the level of physician who was involved in the care of those patients in a teaching hospital. And they found that if you had a physician and an attending taking care of a patient, that they had the lowest complication rate and they tended to see more white patients. If you looked at senior residents, they saw actually more Black patients than any other group, and they had a higher complication rate. And that junior residents actually saw a number of historically marginalized individuals, not as many as the seniors, but more than the attendings, and they had an intermediate complication rate. So I'm hopeful that people can start doing segmentation this way to see whether or not care can be delivered differently. The same group, along with colleagues about 9 other surgical programs around the country, did something that's called the PACS trial. I got a chance to be on their advisory committee. And what it was is they designed a program of study to help surgeons develop what they refer to as cultural dexterity, a way that they can improve the care they deliver to people who may not be of the same cultural background. And they think that they were able to make some progress. It was a it was a crossover trial, not double blinded. But the fact is that their data looks pretty consistent with you can change behaviors through some degrees of education. And it was an interesting trial. So the idea that we can actually do these sorts of changes in surgery, I think, is out there, and I think we need to work at it. But there's a hazard depending on concordant care in order to eliminate health disparities. All the things I show you on the right are those social determinants of health that we talked about. My colleague Daniel Dawes down at Morehouse and Satcher Institute talks about the political determinants of health. He's written a wonderful book on this that describes how inequitable policies and practices and regulations and politics and laws have actually conspired to lower healthcare access and contribute to healthcare inequities as well. So that's not going to be fixed by what we do with respect to workforce. There may be some advocacy things that physicians are able to accomplish because of how they're viewed in society. I'm not going to discount that, but the reason that we want the workforce is because of this concordance issue. Now, the problem also, depending on this, is that we've not graduated enough people. And because the demand for concordant care far exceeds the ability to do it, you'll see on the right side a plot of the ACGME data on race and ethnicity as a function of time in all graduate medical education programs. And that green bar represents African Americans, the red bar represents LHS plus individuals. And you see that that was 4.9%. In 2018-19, it was 4.9% in 2004-05. So it hasn't changed a bit in 15 years. And so that's why we all have to learn how to embrace cultural humility. We used to think of that there was such a thing as cultural competence, where you could master a set of skills of understanding somebody's culture who was different than yours. Well, cultural humility, Marilyn Turvlin and Melanie Turvlin and Jan Marie Garcia out here, as a matter of fact, described back in the 90s. And what they talked about is how you have to subordinate your own culture, the dominant cultural norms, in order to hear and understand and relate to your patient. And it contrasts sharply with a mastery of skills. It represents a continuous commitment to self-evaluation, self-critique, and lifelong learning about your patients. And then, we have these policies that we've somehow put into place, such as if a patient shows up, 10 minutes late for an appointment, you cancel them and reschedule them. Well, I mean, it depends on what their transportation mode is, what happened with them at work, and what all these other things that factor into this that we don't take into account because we have these dominant cultural norms that say you show up on time and we try to get to you on time. And it may not be in the best interest of the patients that we serve. So ACGME has been working to try to change things. They've changed its mission statement, the board did, in order to address the formative element that a lot of places don't have the experience and expertise in this work in order to make it successful. And so we've dedicated ourselves, as we did over 12 now years ago when we started a CLEAR program, to improve quality and safety, as we did 6 years ago when we were looking at well-being to try to improve well-being along with the National Academy of Medicine. And now we're looking at diversity, equity, inclusion. The board also changed its vision statement to incorporate diversity and inclusion as key elements of what they see, and I'll show you both. The top one is the mission statement. It's to eliminate, to actually improve healthcare and population health, and then the elimination of healthcare disparities is consistent with this, and do it by assessing and enhancing the quality of resident physician education through advancements in accreditation and education, representing a formative piece. The vision is the second paragraph, in which the ACGME wants a GME environment with global reach immersed in evidence, data-driven clinical learning and care environments defined by excellence in clinical care, safety, cost effectiveness, professionalism, and diversity and inclusion. And then our office is really focused on trying to educate physicians in the future who are going to more likely serve underserved patients and locate in minoritized communities, because we think it increases healthcare access, improves trust, communication, and outcomes for those most at risk for disparities. And in doing so, we've actually developed some tools, an educational program that's called Equity Matters. And Bonnie Simpson, an orthopedic surgeon, was involved in helping us to really set this up. It's a continuous learning improvement process that we now ask a few learning communities to become involved with. As part of it, we've created some learning materials that are on our site, Learn at ACGME, and I'll show you those in a second. There are about 39 different axes of diversity that we've looked at to try to think about how the people who are from that particular community experience education in GME programs, and then what issues they may run into, and what we may do to help to improve their experiences. And the people who we've asked to become authors of this are people who you may recognize, who are national leaders in this field, who are both in graduate medical education as well as medicine in general. There's a long list of them. All of them work for free. They had contributed their work and their thoughts and made videos for us that are anywhere from 20 minutes to 60 minutes long. And they are now all available on our Learn at ACGME website, and you can access them for free and obtain 18 hours of Category 1 CME credit for doing so. We also invite people to observe the videos and incorporate elements of the videos into their own curricula as they're building out curricula, because there's really good stuff there. And we thought that, well, what's a good adjunct to a large collection of videos? And the answer is a book. And so we're actually doing a textbook right now where we're looking at the foundations of diversity, equity, inclusion to make them companions to the videos that we've already established, so that people can actually use it and work on their own curricula with it. As you know, the AAMC just came out with some competencies. I was fortunate enough to be able to serve on that committee. It has had very interesting uptake in various places. The Wall Street Journal referred to it as woke medicine. But the point on it is that it's a way to approach thinking about how to improve the care that we deliver to patients. We worked with the Macy Foundation and created some tools on the Equity Matters program that they now are going to refer to and access for their group on bias and to improve those elements. Well, the other thing we did in our action steps is we modified common program requirements. The board did, addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion explicitly. And our office developed some new tools so that we could try to assess programs to help the RCs, review committees, figure out whether programs are in accordance. And then we actually extracted some information that we took from the annual program update that we asked program directors to complete. And we're putting that together in a resource that we call the Equity Matters Resource Collection. And it should be available sometime early next year. So here's the thing that everyone is interested in. This is the board certification first time pass rate. The ACGME changed its policy in Section 5 of the Common Program Requirements to say that all programs are going to be set at the same level of pass rate, averaged over 3 years at 80%, and that we're kind of collecting a 7-year rolling ultimate pass rate because we want to now start looking to see whether things correlate with any outcomes during the course of training and then after training. And so it'll be interesting to see how long that first time pass rate holds up. The rationale for this, and this is a paper done by Don Melnick when he talked about, and colleagues of the Step 1 committee, when they talked about how we should not use the USMLE Step 1 exam for something that wasn't intended, which was as a threshold to determine who gets admitted to a residency program. And that he was advocating at that time, or that group was advocating holistic admissions. And holistic admissions is where you look at all sorts of elements that can make a person better, almost like reverse engineering the process, figuring out what makes the physician you want, and then figuring out what those characteristics are that you needed to try to admit, and to try to match the two in the process. But having holistic admissions isn't really fair to people who you admit who may not be the best test takers in the world if you minimize the value of testing, yet we still have this barrier of first time pass rate. And so when you bring people in who aren't good testers, what you have to do is figure out how to make them better testers, making sure that people get resources according to need is an equity practice. And then helping everybody understand how to become better at the things that they're not as good at. So we said 80% of the people who graduate from medical school weren't thinking about taking care of the underserved. Maybe there's something we can do in residency to help to redirect them and find that as a goal that they'd like to be able to, that they could be able to accomplish for us. There's an interesting paper by David Ash, published in JAMA back in 2009, that looked at the use of USMLE Step 1, Step 2 scores on individuals who were obstetricians, and looked at a complication rate and found that the complication rate of people who came from residencies that had higher Step 1, Step 2 scores didn't necessarily correlate with whether they practiced in the low complication rate group or the high complication rate group. And so the thing that mattered the most was the complication rate of the residency program they trained in, which really speaks to improving our learning environments and optimizing the education that gets done during residency, because a lot of people depend on this. One of the things we found is that you stayed in this high complication rate or low complication rate for the next 17 years of your practice. So that was really kind of an interesting study. And I think it was done in obstetrics, but my thinking is it can be done in every specialty, so you can assess the ability or the impact of those standardized exams. Yet nobody has done it. This is a paper by our colleague Dowan Boatwright that looked at AOA selection. And if you use AOA selection in determining who you admit to your program, then in fact you are building in racism and bias into your process. Because when they did the adjusted odds ratio, adjusting for Step 1 scores, research productivity, community service, gold human medicine membership, that if you were an African American student, you had 1/6 the chance of being admitted to AOA than if you were a white student. And if you're an Asian student, you had 1/2 the chance of being admitted to AOA than a white student. And if you give credit to AOA selection in your residency selection process, then you're baking in racism into the process ab initio. This is the common program requirement we started, 1C, the board started. It says that a program in partnership with the sponsoring institution must engage in a mission-driven, ongoing, systematic recruitment and retention of a diverse workforce of residents, fellows if you have them, faculty members, senior administrative GME staff, and other relevant members of the academic community. And so I've been talking a lot about race, but diversity obviously crosses a number of different axes, and any of them, as they impact healthcare, could be important to generate a workforce that can help to solve problems. Our mission is to improve healthcare and population health, and we do it through resident education so that there's a workforce to address it. And so whatever element of diversity that you'd like to work on, it's something that probably needs to be done if there's a disparity. The idea in this is we'd like people to think longitudinally about bringing people into medical school, because competing for the same limited number of fourth-year medical students is not really a strategy. Everybody's going to get a job for the most part. And so what we need to do is bring more people onto the pathway. And so if we start in elementary school, high school, college, med school, post-bac, any of those places that we can touch students and direct them into careers in medicine where they otherwise might have gone, we will increase the number of fourth-year medical students eventually that we'll have to select for our residencies. And so the LCME placed about 12 years ago a standard 3 in the standards for the medical school, where medical schools had to work with pre-medical learners to try to advance them into medicine. And I have to say, for the first 5 or 6 years, it was probably the least well subscribed to standard. But fortunately, things have started to improve lately, and the number of diverse people in medical school is now starting to go up again. The thought around whether graduate medical education can be involved in this comes from my own personal experience, where I used to run a lot of pathway programs at the University of Chicago. And one of the things I would find is that I would often pick on a minoritized resident who was in a program because I knew him, I trained him typically. And so what I do is I'd say, can I have a high school student shadow you today because they're here for their summer program? And they'd say, well, sure. And so the person who was under the microscope to the greatest extent already in their program now has a kid with a backpack and a white coat following him around. And people are thinking that, well, here's an unprofessional thing to have. You've got a high school student following you around. That was putting double leverage, negative leverage, I guess, on that individual. Wouldn't it be so much better if the program director came in the morning and said, look, we've got 8 high school students on service today, 2 are going to team A, 2 are going to B, 2 are going to C, 2 are going to D. And now everybody knows that this is important to the program. This is core and central to what the program thinks is important in order to try to increase the diversity of the workforce. And it's not an prioritized learner who is now subjected to the thoughts of his peers or whatever that's being put to task on this and paying an additional tax. So the information we started on the annual program update is we asked programs, what are you doing to increase recruitment and retention of residents and faculty? And so each year I get about anywhere 12,300 now, I think we're up to, responses from around the country who tell us what they do. If we could figure out a way of amassing that information, processing it and putting it into chunks so that the whole community can see what their colleagues are doing, then it might become an interesting resource. And that's exactly what we do. We started a program about 3 years ago honoring Dr. Barbara Ross Lee, the first African-American woman dean of a medical school. And we now have entrants for that award who tell us in greater detail what they do to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then we have the ACGME learning communities that we formed, and they all have capstone projects. And their capstone projects were to be addressing a problem that is unsolved in improving diversity, equity, inclusion in the learning environment. So we're amassing this big thing. I've got 3 analysts now who are working with me who are extracting this information. And I'll show you just briefly what people are doing. So obviously Nth Dimensions is mentioned in this one. They recruit for their sub-internship rotators from a diverse pool. I think you may even see your own program in some of the things that we see here, because you guys do a very nice job in recruiting people from around the country to come here and train. The SNMA sponsors and the Perry Initiative activities that increase women in orthopedic surgery are supported by another program. And it goes on and on. We've got lots of these things that people can have told us about. And here are just a few of the ideas that are there. There's second look weekends. There's the Department of Orthopedic Surgery created a diversity inclusion committee consisting of students, faculty, staff, residents, faculty, and staff with the charge to develop initiatives, change initiatives within the department and the metropolitan community. Linking the community has been one of those things that we see actually is very effective in trying to recruit residents to your programs. I could click on things like this for a very long time. There's LGBTQ initiatives. The Department of DEI has a focus area that's for increased funding, diversity focused efforts. There's lots of good ideas, and next year you'll see them. And the thought on this one is, as you use the Equity Matters collection, you'll compare yourself to a program that we've talked about that does this, and then you'll see if you kind of fit into that sort of category. Am I a place that has high diversity or low diversity already? Am I a place that's rural, or am I a place that's urban? Am I a place that has a big residency program, or are we a fellowship and only have 2 or 3 people every year? But there's something almost everyone can do, because I think that if GME puts its effort toward this, then you'll see even more activity than we see with just the UME people who are charged with doing this, because residents model what they see. and students model who they see as well. And so if you have the GME programs that are doing this, then you'll also find that the medical schools will get better at it. And in fact, half of the programs we accredit at ACGME don't have a medical school. And so they can develop direct communication links with STEM programs in their communities to try to figure out how we can increase access and thinking around careers in medicine. So here are the Equity Matters ideas that are coming together for the collection. We have the annual program update, the DEI award, and the learning communities from Equity Matters program. Each one's going to have the title of the approach or strategy, what it is, why you do it, variations that we see around the country on it, who's actually putting this into place, and we're going to individual programs and asking them how they were able to put this in place in their institutions. So we're very excited about it. It's going to look a lot like Carl Bullamorio's second trial site, and Carl let us use his site in order to kind of model it. Well, it's my favorite part of Marketplace is now let's look at the numbers. So here are the number of residents who are in training right now in this past year. The data for the next year isn't ready yet. So there are about 5.7% of the residents were African American. That number for Hispanic is a little off because we classified Hispanic individuals a little differently last year. We're fixing that right now so that we'll get those numbers to you when they're available. But if you want to look as a function of specialty, I saw in one of the papers it claimed that orthopedic surgery was the worst. Orthopedic surgery is not the worst. There are other worsers. And you're under that 5.7% in the 2021 data. But if you look at over the last 10 years, you're still not the worst. And that data shows you that's 4.8% over those 10 years. And orthopedic surgery is down there at a 3.3%. So it's not the worst, but it's certainly not the best. There's a lot of work you can do in orthopedic surgery. There are a lot of programs in orthopedic surgery. There are a lot of fellowships, and that's what this slide shows you. This is from Sarah Brotherton's paper from last year. Her new paper is going to be coming out in about 2 weeks in JAMA that will show you the new data around this. There are a bunch of chances we get to do the right thing, and yet we seemingly don't. There are only about 189 residents last year in core orthopedic surgery. There's very few fellows across the country. So if you're a fellowship director, think about bringing in some diversity if you can. The idea is that there's so few people that you can actually look at a number and say, well, I know that person. And that's not a good thing, right? Here are the actual numbers from our data, which is a little bit different than Sarah Brotherton's. You see that there are 196 people who call themselves African Americans, describe themselves, who are in residency programs right now. That number is up this year, but you can see it's jumped up about 30 people or so from the last year. But the numbers before that were pretty flat. If you want to do this for the core residents, this is residents and fellows. This is core residents, 184. Core program folks here who are African American out of 4,415. And these are all years of training. If you want to look at the fellows, there are 12 fellows in the entire country who are African American right now. So we've got a lot of work to do to improve the fellowship. So now if you want to look at this as genderized as a function of race and intersectionality, you'll see these are white women here in the darker color blue, and the lighter color blue are white men in orthopedic surgery. And you see that you've gone from around 3,500 up to that 4,400 that we looked at. So almost 1,000 new orthopedic surgeons seats have been created in all years of training. And you see that most of them went to white men. Asian men are the lightest blue, and the darkest blue are Asian women. And those numbers went up a little bit for Asian men, not moving so much for Asian women, unfortunately. And then if you want to look at the underrepresented minorities, I'll blow it up for you. There it is. There are the Latinx individuals. You see Latinx men, the lighter color, Latinx women, the lower color, almost no Latinx women. And then the African American women, super flat over that last 10-year period that you're looking at. And African American men have gone up just slightly in that period of time. And if you want to see who, as a line plot here, who went up, white men. There you go. And you'll see that the underrepresented minority folks are down at the bottom. There's almost no movement there at all. If you want to look at percentage of people, 10 years ago, 9% of 3.9% of people were African American, 4.2% of people are African American today. So we've made no progress at all in orthopedic surgery in terms of percentage of the people who are there. I don't know if you guys knew that already, but it's something that I want you to know, because if you're going to make an effort, you've got an opportunity. Here's data on Black men. You'll see that those numbers went up. Black women, just flat, and column is the open CE here. Latinx people, we show here, the number of men went down, the number of women has gone up just very slightly, and the numbers are very, very low to begin with. Here's my favorite slide. So this shows you the concentration of people in training programs across the country. The first group here are Latinx orthopedic surgery residents. The middle group are African American, and the final group are the sum of those two plus Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders and Native Americans. So here's what I show. If you're a Black resident, there are 201 programs across the country for core orthopedic training. 90 of those programs, 99, don't have a single African American in all 5 years of training, which I find shocking. And that, in fact, if you look at where they are trained, that 50% of all Black residents are trained in only 22 programs across the country. So if we were to map this out, you could actually see where people practiced. There'd be 22 programs that would have numbers, and then no other program in the country has a number. I find that also appalling. That's 10% of programs, 11% of programs train half of the Black residents in the country. And I told the earlier group that the group that trains the most is that 17 is Howard, that school that was left open by Abraham Flexner back in 1910. So that's what I really wanted to point out, that there's this concentration effect, that so many programs aren't participating at all, and that we all have things that we can do to try to drive these numbers. But even admitting one fellow that you wouldn't have otherwise admitted, or admitting one resident that you would otherwise admit, will have a national impact. So here are the core residents that come in every year. There are 52 that I'm showing you here, but that's not what I want to show you. These are fellows across these are residents across the country. So 52 in the entire country as African Americans that you bring in, and it's really a shame. Systematic retention, and these are the same ones that everybody's admitting. So as we talked in the previous lecture, that in fact people are putting people on the list, but they're the same people that they're putting on everybody's list, and so we're not really getting more candidates in. What's retention? Retention means let's get individualized learning plans for everyone, provide resources according to need, and let's graduate more people. You'll see every year we graduate 26 people who are African American. And that's the highest number we've had since 2013-14. And that was the single highest year we've ever had in terms of graduating African Americans in orthopedic surgery. Fellows, 12 fellows in the country, I already told you. And the number has not really been much higher than that over the last decade. If you look at the last 10 years of orthopedic fellows, this is the data, and these are the specialties, and this is the percentage of individuals. These are the number of graduates. There have been 3 foot and ankle people in the last 10 years who graduated from fellowships in ortho sports, 62, which is the largest number of Black orthopedic surgeons of any of the specialties. If you look at, so that's the state that you're in. What happens if you bring people to an environment where they're unaccustomed to it? I think it's going to have to wait till a later time, because we are out of time. But what I wanted to tell you about is that we have these things that we call program requirements 6B6. Let me flash forward to that one. And this really looks at the people who are dismissed in various programs. So these are the withdrawal numbers. I'll show you that one just for your edification. The dismissal rate of Blacks relative to whites in the last 10 years is about tenfold. So tenfold Black people are dismissed for every one white person who's dismissed in orthopedic surgery. Latinx rate is only about 2x, is 1.8%, and Asian white is 0.88%. So fewer Asians than whites are dismissed by their numbers. Withdrawal rate for African Americans is almost 3x compared to their white counterparts. And transfer, nobody transfers from programs for the most part. It's about even across the board. So here's 6B6. This one says that programs and partnerships with their sponsoring institutions must engage and must provide a civil, professional, equitable, and respectful environment free from discrimination, sexual and other forms of harassment, mistreatment, abuse, coercion of students, residents, faculty, and staff. We're trying to achieve that belongingness, justice, and respect that needs to exist in our programs. And I'll stop. Thanks very much for your attention. If there are questions, I don't know if you have time.
grab the mic if it turns on so people can hear. So maybe I'll be able to turn it on. Let's please take some questions.
There's a two-handed mic up there.
Okay. All right, there we go. So questions. Anybody have a question? I'll hand you the mic. I have a question. I'll start out with what you guys are thinking.
All right.
And one is a very compelling concept. You were talking about looking at the outcomes of training in terms of the patient's outcome.
Yep.
Relative to variables. What struck me as I thought about that was the potential unintended consequences.
Sure.
And thinking about the group that we're focused on today, who might be taking care of a larger percentage of under cared for individuals, what that might turn into an outcome.
Yeah, I know where you're going with that. So about maybe 15 years ago, 12, 15 years ago, I was asked to sit on an NQF, National Quality Forum panel, to develop metrics around healthcare disparities. And everything that we looked at would be worsened for minority physicians because they take care of people whose outcomes are based in an environment that has absolutely nothing to do with the physician-patient encounter. And so we did a lot of work, wrote some interesting papers, and nothing ever came of it. And with the MIPS program, for instance, where Medicare was going to try to figure out how to improve the quality of care by looking at the quality metrics of physicians, there's almost nothing that they could do that wasn't going to burden minoritized physicians taking care of disproportionately minoritized individuals, that wasn't going to hurt them. So the exact same people who you'd like to improve their ability to be compensated for the care they provide would be penalized in programs like that. And so it's not really gotten a lot of traction or further traction, the traction that it needs, because that is exactly the problem. There are these confounding things that have nothing to do with the physician care that you cannot correct for because we can't fix adverse childhood events. We can't fix the trauma that occurs in certain communities. We can't fix a number of these things that access to food, access to exercise, access to transportation, and these all adversely impact the care that you can provide. So I think either you have to come up with some sort of a coefficient in order to try to account for it and benefit some people by it. And then that's going to be hard. You have to look at their patient population. You have to look at who they are as physicians in order to do it. It would be extraordinarily complicated in order to make that work. But it's a great question.
Yeah, at the very least, we have to recognize that issue.
Hey, I'm Kaz. I'm one of the R3s here. As we move away from things like step 1 and AOA and all those things, do you have suggestions for how residency programs should be looking at applicants through the cycle as we move away from sort of objective, or not objective data, but sort of statistics and looking at a more holistic approach?
Yeah, so I was telling the group at dinner last night, one of my favorite podcasts is Revisionist History, Malcolm Gladwell. And there was a really interesting segment that he did where the former late Justice Louis Scalia, Antonin Scalia, actually talked about one of his best clerks. And the whole program was predicated on the LSAT and the importance of doing well in the LSAT in order to go to a T14 school for law school. And what Scalia's answer was, you have to go to a T14 school in order to be a Supreme Court clerk. And so what do you test to determine whether you get into a T14 school? How well you do on the LSAT? What do you do to do well on the LSAT? You have to think fast. You have to read fast. You have to make very quick judgments and decisions and apply logic or whatever it's asking you to do. And you do it for a brief time, and it's a timed, a speeded exam, so that if you don't do it in the time given to you, you score lower than people who can do it faster. Well, he said his best clerk was someone who he actually got from another justice who was retiring and kind of farmed their clerks out to the rest of the justices. And what he said was that his best clerk was a former or graduate of the Ohio State University, which is not a T14 school. So what skills do you need as a clerk that these great students who went to the T14 schools didn't have? Well, he could think about things more deeply because you've got 3 months to write a brief. as opposed to having to answer something very quickly at that moment. So what you need in order to have a good clerk are skills that are deep thinking, that are rooted in strong logic, clearly, but you don't have to do it in a very short period, in a very contracted period. And so maybe those are the people who you need to be recruiting to be clerks. So in that same vein, they looked at the rainmakers in law firms, in large law firms, and they wanted to try to figure out how to reverse engineer the process to get more people who could be rainmakers. So they asked the team that did Moneyball to come in and study what it took to be a rainmaker or what the rainmakers had in common. And the thing they had in common was that they all worked blue collar jobs before they went to law school. And so we need to do the same thing in medicine. We need to figure out, first of all, what constitutes the best doctors, what does best mean? And then figure out what we could have known about them before they went into medical school, and to try to find more of those people to get to medical school. And the same thing is true for residency. If you want to find a thing that you can select, figure out what your best residents did, whatever best you define best as, and then go ahead and see if we can get more people who've done those things. If what you define as best is people who've gone off to serve underserved people, who've gone off to Uganda, who've gone off and done amazing things in research, see if there's a commonality that you can actually pick up and track so that you can select those people. I think it gets you closer to the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish than looking at a standardized exam. It's easy to measure, but it is not referable to a particular outcome that you'd like to see.
I think we have time for one more. Dr. Sabatini.
Thank you so much for all of the knowledge, wisdom you have shared with us today. I'm going to ask you an impossible question, and I recognize that it's impossible, but as a way to sort of walk out of here with an action plan for our department, what is the single most important thing that we as an orthopedic surgery department can do to increase the number of underrepresented minorities coming into our program? And what is the single most important thing we can do to ensure retention of our residents based on your knowledge of this profound amount of literature?
Well, I'll start with the easiest one first. I think to retain residents, you have to instill a sense of belongingness in the department. And you know, the fact is that we dismiss so few residents across the country. You see 9 in the last 10 years out of the 201 programs in orthopedic surgery, means that we're not failing a lot of people because we've got a lot of vehement racists that are in orthopedic surgery and we're just kicking Black residents out. That's not what's happening. What we're doing is we're just making life miserable and tough for many of those people. And trying to fix that problem, I think everybody probably has people who are disagreeable and treat people in a discriminatory fashion. And while we don't want to say, well, we can do without those people, we will get them off our faculty somehow. I think what we have to figure out is how to reform them and help them understand that people bring different things to residencies and they don't have to be as rigid in our thinking as we may have imagined that they needed to be. And so by helping our colleagues understand that you can be a great academic surgeon, but you may not look like every great academic surgeon that is up to that point in their training. You know, to look, and you actually mentioned this yesterday, Dr. Zimmel, that, you know, to know what someone's outcome in their future career is going to be when they're 20 years old or 25 years old is really because you have a model of what you think it should look like. And if they don't fit that model, then they can't be that great surgeon that eventually you think they will, that you want to create. So I think you have to broaden people's perspectives of what constitutes excellence or the ability to mold into excellence by the work that you do. We have to start looking at residents as our replacements as opposed to residents who are going to go off and just do something that's going to be, you know, useful to communities, but it's not going to be what we do at UCSF. So I think that's the first thing I would do. I make our environments more belonging and work with our faculty to call them in. To say that, you know, you may have thought this in the past, we're going to give you a pass on that and say, let's do this differently in the future, and you can be a part of it. Now, how do you get the best people into the training programs? I think is a little harder. I think, first of all, increasing the work that you're doing to try to bring more learners into medicine is an important thing. So outreach that you do to younger learners is important. If you're trying to figure out how to put residents in your programs, I think working with programs like Interventions, continuing that work, expanding whatever programs you have, Visiting clerkships are a good way to do it, ensuring that all the visiting clerks you have get a chance to interview with you, because that's a scarce commodity. And I think you have to figure out also how to get to those early first year medical students from your own medical school. I mean, so when I was at the University of Chicago, I was the only African American medical student in my class the year I came in. And this is one of the things I think has motivated me to want to look at workforce going forward. And what I recognized is that you're not going to change the number of people at the University of Chicago's medical school overnight. So you got to work with college students, you got to work with high school students in order to build up those people and figure out ways of getting them there. But then the real thing you wanted to change was the number of faculty. Well, how do you change the number of faculty? Well, you got to change the number of residents and fellows you train. So you don't start with a thing that's going to change it tomorrow. It's a kind of a longitudinal process. And you recognize that you have people that you start with when they're 14 years old that eventually are going to be assistant professors at the University of Chicago. And that's what I've seen. I've seen it happen in my career, where I took a kid from King High School at 14 years old and now is on the faculty at Northwestern. So that's the sort of thing that you have to recognize, that it's a long process, that you have to be consistent. You have to keep watering, keep growing, figure out what the next program is going to be in order to drive them onto that pathway with good mentorship, good sponsorship. And that's how you go.
Thank you.
Easy. You're welcome.
Thank you so much.